Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank the organizers for this really superb conference. The two lectures this morning, I would like to associate myself 100% with the comments of the previous speaker and 99% with those of Barry Zwicker. The 1% is that when he mentioned that Bertrand Russell wrote this little book called Principia Mathematica. He was the junior co-author, and Barry didn't mention that the senior co-author was my professor, Alfred North Whitehead. So next time, Barry, you'll get 100%. The title of my lecture is Building What? How SCADs Can Be Hidden in Plain Sight. At 5:21 p.m. on 9/11, Building 7 of the World Trade Center collapsed even though it had not been hit by a plane, a fact that is important because of the widespread acceptance of the idea, in spite of its scientific absurdity, that the Twin Towers collapsed because of the impact of the airplanes and then the jet fuel-fed fires. The collapse of Building 7 thereby challenges the official account of the destruction of the World Trade Center, according to which it was accomplished by Al-Qaeda hijackers, even if you do accept the scientifically impossible explanation given by the government. This fact was most recently stressed in the title of a book review of my latest book, Mysterious Collapse of World Trade Center 7, by Medal of Science winner Lynn Margulis. In the title of her review, 2 Hit, 3 Down, The Biggest Lie. The reason why Building 7 poses such a problem to the official theory is that this account entails that for the first time in the known universe, a steel-framed high-rise building had been brought down by fire. And science does not like unprecedented occurrences when dealing with physical phenomena. New York Times writer James Glantz, who himself has a PhD in physics, wrote, "Experts say no building like it, a modern steel-reinforced high-rise, had ever collapsed because of an uncontrolled fire." Glantz then quoted a structural engineer as saying, "Within the structural engineering community, Building 7 is considered to be much more important than the Twin Towers because engineers had no answer to the question, why did 7 come down?" Equally remarkable, besides the mere fact that the building came down, was the way it came down, in virtual free fall, making it appear to be an example of the type of controlled demolition known as implosion, in which explosives and/or incendiaries are used to slice the building's steel support columns in such a way as to cause the building to collapse in upon itself into its own footprint. CBS anchor Dan Rather, not one to let a remarkable fact go unremarked, said, "It's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen on television where a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down." Dan Rather, moreover, was not the only reporter to make such a comment. Al Jones, reporter for a New York City news station, said, "I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion, looked like it had been done by a demolition crew." Moreover, where Jones and Rather, being laymen in these matters, merely said that the collapse of Building 7 looked like a controlled demolition, experts looking at the video could see that it was a controlled demolition. In 2006, for example, a Dutch filmmaker asked Danny Joewinkel, the owner of a controlled demolition company in Holland, to comment on a video of the collapse of Building 7 without telling him what it was. Joewinkel had never heard that a third building had come down that day. After viewing the film, Jowinkle said, "They simply blew up columns, and the rest caved in afterwards. This is controlled demolition." When asked if he was certain, Jowinkle replied, "Absolutely, it's been imploded. This was a hired job. A team of experts did this." Besides the obviousness from the very appearance of the collapse that it had been brought down by explosives, there were testimonies about explosions in World Trade Center 7. One of these was provided by Michael Hess, New York City's corporation counsel and very good friend of Mayor Rudy Giuliani. While on his way back to City Hall, Hess was stopped for an interview at 11:57 that morning. During that interview, he said, "I was in the Emergency Management Center on the 23rd floor of World Trade Center 7 when all the power went out. Another gentleman and I walked down to the 8th floor," he meant the 6th, "where there was an explosion and we were trapped on the 8th floor," they went back up, "with smoke, thick smoke, all around us for about an hour and a half, but the New York Fire Department just came and got us out." Hess thereby reported a mid-morning explosion in Building 7. The other gentleman, Barry Jennings, of the New York City Housing Authority, reported the same thing during another man-on-the-street interview, reporting that he and Mr. Hess had been walking down the stairs when they became trapped by a big explosion. Jennings, in fact, said that explosions continued going off in the building while they were waiting to be rescued. Also, during the late afternoon, reporter Peter DeMarco of New York Daily News said, "There was a rumble. The building's top row of windows popped out, then all the windows on the 39th floor, then the 38th floor, pop, pop, pop was all you heard until the building sunk into a rising cloud of gray." In addition to the visual and testimonial evidence, there was clear physical evidence that Building 7 was brought down by explosives. Within a few months of 9/11, 3 professors from Worcester Polytechnic Institute had issued a report about a piece of steel from this building that was described in a New York Times story by James Glantz and Eric Lipton as perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. Part of the mystery was the fact that the steel had become extremely thin, indicating that the steel had melted away, even though no fire in the building was believed to be hot enough to melt steel outright. Describing this mysterious piece of steel more fully, an article entitled "The Deep Mystery of Melted Steel" in the Worcester Polytechnic Institute's magazine said, "Steel, which has a melting point of 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, may weaken and bend, but does not melt during an ordinary office fire. Yet a 1-inch column has been reduced to a 1/2-inch thickness. Its edges, which are curled like a paper scroll, have been thinned to almost razor sharpness. Gaping holes, some larger than a silver dollar, let light shine through a formerly solid steel flange. The Swiss cheese appearance shocked all of these fire-wise professors who expected to see distortion and bending, but not holes. Indeed, the thinning in the holes suggested that the steel had been vaporized. Explaining as early as November 2001 why fire could not account for this mysterious steel, Glantz paraphrased one of these 3 professors as saying, "It appeared to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures." Another New York Times story reported that the same phenomenon was announced by Professor Abulhassan Ostaneh-Ozzel of the University of California at Berkeley, who had received a National Science Foundation grant to spend 2 weeks at Ground Zero studying the steel. According to reporter Kenneth Chang, Professor Ostaneh-Ozzel, speaking of a horizontal I-beam from World Trade Center 7, said, Parts of the flat top of the eye, once 5/8 of an inch thick, had vaporized. These reports clearly showed that something other than fire had caused effects, because the fires in the building could not possibly have been hotter than 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, while the boiling point of steel is roughly the same as that of iron, which is over 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But even if the steel had simply melted, that by itself would have proved the point, because the melting point of steel is only a little less than that of iron, which is 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas the fire, to repeat, could not, even under the most ideal circumstances, have been above 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Therefore, clear evidence against the official account of Building 7, according to which it was brought down by fire, existed in plain sight, in the form of memories and videos of its collapse, testimonies about explosions, and physical evidence reported even in the New York Times. The reasonable inference to draw from this evidence, namely that the official account is false because explosives were used, was reinforced by the first official report on World Trade Center 7, which was issued in 2002 by FEMA. The scientists who wrote the report for FEMA admitted that their best hypothesis as to why the building came down had only a low probability of occurrence, which is science speak for, we don't have a clue. In addition to all these facts, World Trade Center 7 was a very big building, being 47 stories high. Although it was dwarfed by the 110-story Twin Towers, it would, in half of the states in our nation, been the tallest building in the state. For all of these reasons, the collapse of this building should have become one of the best-known facts about 9/11, but it did not. A Zogby poll in May 2006 found that 43% of the American people were still unaware that World Trade Center 7 had collapsed. And that same year, as mentioned earlier, Daniel Winkle of Holland still did not know about it, even though this was his field of expertise. A dramatic example of the fact that this building's collapse has not been prominent in the public consciousness was provided in a New York City courtroom in September 2009. Judge Edward Lehner was hearing arguments about a petition sponsored by New York City CAN to allow residents to vote on whether New York City should have its own investigation of the World Trade Center attacks. After Judge Lehner had observed that the 9/11 Commission had already investigated 9/11 and had issued a report, Dennis McMahon, a lawyer for New York City CAN, said that this report had left many unanswered questions. One of the biggest questions, he added, is why did Building 7 come down? At which point Judge Lehner said, "Building what?" McMahon replied, "World Trade Center 7. There were 3 buildings that came down." When the judge, continuing to illustrate his ignorance about this building, asked if it was the one owned by the Port Authority, McMahon replied, no, it was owned by Larry Silverstein. Judge Lehner, it should be emphasized, is not simply an ordinary American citizen. Besides being a judge who was presiding in New York City, he was assigned to a case involving the 9/11 attacks in this city. So his ignorance about this building was surprising, and yet it was typical. With his query, "Building what?" he expressed the ignorance manifested in 2006 by controlled demolition expert Daniel Winkle and almost half of the American people. How can we account for this widespread ignorance? In a New York Times story in November 2001, James Glantz wrote, that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was a mystery that under normal circumstances would probably have captured the attention of the city and the world. Clearly, these were not normal circumstances. Part of the abnormality was the fact that Building 7, while huge, was overshadowed by the Twin Towers, which were over twice as tall. But this fact by itself would not account for the enormous ignorance, because, as people indicated at the time, as Glantz pointed out, there were reasons why the collapse of 7 should have been an even bigger story than the collapse of the towers. Why was it not? The answer seems to be that it was a deliberately suppressed story. This conclusion is supported by the following facts. First, after 9/11 itself, our television networks played videos of the Twin Towers being hit by the planes and then collapsing over and over and over. But the collapse of Building 7 was seldom, if ever, shown again on mainstream television. Second, when the 9/11 Commission report was issued in 2004, it did not even mention the collapse of this building. Third, after NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, took over from FEMA the task of explaining the destruction of the World Trade Center, it repeatedly delayed its report on Building 7 over and over. In 2003, NIST said that this report would be issued along with its report on the Twin Towers, the draft of which was to appear in September 2004. However, even though NIST's report on the Twin Towers did not actually appear until 2005, the promised report on Building 7 was not included. NIST said it would appear in 2006. But when August of 2006 came, NIST said it is anticipated that a draft report on World Trade Center 7 will be released by early 2007. But it was not released in 2007, whether early or late. NIST instead projected that it would release draft reports on July 8, 2008, followed by final reports in August of that year. Instead, the draft report did not appear until August, and the final report not until November of 2008, when the Bush-Cheney administration was about to leave office. Moreover, in 2008, when NIST was accused of having deliberately delayed this report, it lied, saying that it had worked on this report only since 2005 and hence for only 3 years, the same amount of time it had worked on the report of the Twin Towers. However, NIST had filed progress reports on World Trade Center 7 in December 2002 and May 2003. In June 2004, it published an interim report, and in April 2005, it released another preliminary report. Then, after ceasing work on this building, evidently, while finishing up the report on the Twin Towers in 2005, NIST then said the investigation of World Trade Center 7 resumed. In truth, therefore, NIST had worked on its report on Building 7 for almost 6 years, not merely 3. So there was good reason to suspect that it had been deliberately delayed. In any case, when the draft for public comment did finally appear in August 2008, it was announced at a press conference with much bravado. Shyam Sundar, NIST lead investigator for the World Trade Center, said, "Our take-home message today is that the reason for the collapse of World Trade Center 7 is no longer a mystery. World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives." The mainstream media, for the most part, simply repeated Sundar's claims. For example, an Associated Press story entitled "Report, Fire, Not Bombs, Leveled World Trade Center 7 Building" began by saying, "Federal investigators said Thursday they have solved a mystery of September 11th. the collapse of World Trade Center 7 Building 7, a source of long-running conspiracy theories. Then, after reinforcing this message by quoting Sunder's assurance that the reason for the collapse of World Trade Center 7 is no longer a mystery, this story concluded by quoting Sunder's claim that the science behind NIST's finding is incredibly conclusive, so that the public should really recognize that science is really behind what we have said. However, reporters could have easily discovered that this was not so. They could have seen, in fact, that NIST World Trade Center 7 report committed scientific fraud in the technical sense, as defined by the National Science Foundation. One type of fraud is falsification, which includes omitting data. NIST, while claiming it found no evidence of a controlled demolition event, simply omitted an enormous amount of evidence that explosions had brought World Trade Center 7 down. Besides failing to mention the testimonial evidence discussed earlier, NIST's report on this building omitted various types of physical evidence. Take, for example, the piece of Swiss cheese steel reported by the 3 professors. This was included as an appendix to the 2002 FEMA report. And after describing this piece of steel, the professors said, a detailed study into this mechanism, the mechanism of this phenomenon, is needed. When NIST took over from FEMA the responsibility of explaining the destruction of the World Trade Center, NIST director promised that its reports would address all major recommendations contained in the FEMA report. However, when NIST's report on Building 7 appeared in 2008, it did not even mention this mysterious piece of Swiss cheese steel. Indeed, NIST even claimed that no steel from Building 7 was identified. Another example, Deutsche Bank, which had a building close to the World Trade Center that had been contaminated with dust, hired the R.J. Lee Group, a scientific research organization, to prove to its insurance company that the dust contaminating its building was not ordinary building dust, as the insurance company was claiming, but had resulted from the destruction of the World Trade Center. The reports issued by the R.J. Lee company proved that the dust was indeed World Trade Center dust because it had its unique chemical signature. Part of this signature was spherical iron particles, and this meant, the R.J. Lee Group said, that iron had melted during the World Trade Center event, producing spherical metallic particles. The R.J. Lee Group also found that temperatures had been reached at which lead would have undergone vaporization, meaning over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hence, the R.J. Lee reports, which were issued in 2003 and 4, provided additional evidence that temperatures had been reached that significantly exceeded those that could have been produced by fire. These reports, which were made known in an article published in January 2008 by a group of scientists led by physicist Stephen Jones, were simply ignored by NIST. Another study was carried out by scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey, which is a government agency. Besides also finding iron particles, these scientists found that something had melted molybdenum, which has an extremely high melting point, almost 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Although these scientists failed to mention this discovery in the published version of their report, the Stephen Jones Group, having obtained their data through a FOIA report, pointed out that these U.S. Geological Survey scientists had devoted considerable study to this particle of molybdenum. So they didn't just overlook it, they had suppressed this information. NIST, however, failed to mention this discovery, even though it was by another federal agency. Still another example. A report by Stephen Jones and several other scientists, including University of Copenhagen chemist Niels Harrit, showed that the World Trade Center dust contained unreacted nanothermite. Unlike ordinary thermite, which is an incendiary, nanothermite is a high explosive. This report by Harrit, Jones, and their colleagues did not appear until 2009. So NIST in 2008 could not have mentioned it. However, given the standard guidelines for investigating fires, they definitely should have checked the dust for evidence of thermite and its various forms, including thermate and nanothermite. When asked whether it did, NIST said no. When reporter Jennifer Abel of the Hartford Advocate asked NIST spokesman Michael Newman why not, he replied, because there was no evidence of that. When she asked the obvious follow-up question, how can you know there's no evidence if you don't look for it first? He replied, if you're looking for something that isn't there, you're wasting your time and the taxpayers' money. Besides omitting evidence, when I made that statement in Cambridge the other night, Lynn Margulis was in the audience, and she piped up, this is the first time they've ever shown any concern about wasting the taxpayers' money. Besides omitting evidence, partly by simply refusing to look for it, NIST also committed the type of scientific fraud called fabrication, which means simply making up results. For example, in offering its explanation as to how fire caused Building 7 to collapse, NIST said that the culprit was thermal expansion, which means simply that the fire heated up the steel and it expanded. Expanding steel beams on the 13th floor, NIST claims, caused a steel girder connecting columns 44 and 79 to break loose. Having lost its support, column 79 failed, starting a chain reaction that led all 81 other columns to fail. Now, ignoring the question of whether that's even remotely possible, let's just focus on the issue, why did that girder fail? NIST's answer was, in World Trade Center 7, no studs were installed on the girders. These are shear studs, big things. In another passage, NIST said floor beams had shear studs, but the girders that supported the floor beams did not have shear studs. However, NIST's interim report on World Trade Center 7, which was issued back in 2004, before it had developed this girder failure theory, had said that shear studs were used to anchor most of the beams and girders, including the particular girder in question. Another example of fabrication, although in its 2004 interim report, NIST had said that by 4:45 p.m. that day, the fire on floor 12 was burned out. It claimed in its 2008 report that at 15 minutes later, 5 o'clock, just 21 minutes before the building collapsed, this fire was still going strong. Both of these examples of fabrication, incidentally, were discovered by Chris Sarnes, who is here today. Chris, where are you? Stand up. You deserve applause for that. Besides omitting and fabricating evidence, NIST affirmed a miracle, meaning a violation of a basic law of physics. This issue was treated in a cartoon many of you have seen. The professor is up on the board and writing formula X times Y equals this and this. But one of the lines simply says, then a miracle happens. And this is funny because that's one thing you absolutely cannot do in a scientific report, is affirm a miracle. And yet, this is what NIST does. I'll explain. Members of the 9/11 Truth Movement had from very early on, having seen the video, saying, that building's coming down in free fall, or at least very close to it. But NIST constantly denied this. In its draft report of August 2008, NIST said that the time it took the upper floors, meaning the only ones you could see on the video, to come down was approximately 40% longer than the computed free fall time and was consistent with physical principles. As this statement implies, any assertion that the building did come down in free fall would not be consistent with physical principles, meaning the laws of physics. Explaining why not, Shyam Sundar himself said, a free fall time would be the fall time of an object that had no structural components below it. The time it took for those 17 floors to disappear was roughly 40% longer than free fall, and that is not at all unusual because there was structural resistance that was provided, all that steel and concrete. And you had a sequence of structural failures. Remember, 79 then causes all those other columns to fall. You had a sequence of structural failures that had to take place. Everything was not instantaneous. In saying this, Sundar was, of course, presupposing NIST's rejection of controlled demolition, which could have produced a free-fall collapse by causing all 82 columns to fail simultaneously, in favor of NIST's fire theory, which, of course, necessitated a theory of progressive collapse. In response, high school physics teacher David Chandler challenged Sundar's denial of free fall, pointing out that Sundar's 40% claim contradicted a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity. Chandler then placed a video on the internet showing that by measuring this publicly visible quantity, anyone knowing elementary physics, dig, dig, anyone knowing elementary physics could see that for about 2.5 seconds, the acceleration of the building is indistinguishable from free fall. Amazingly, in NIST's final report, which came out in November 2008, it admitted free fall. Dividing the building's descent into 3 stages, NIST described the second phase as a free fall descent over approximately 8 stories at gravitational acceleration for approximately 2.25 seconds. So they just quibbled about a quarter of a second. So after presenting over 600 pages of descriptions, photographs, testimonies, graphs, analyses, explanations, and mathematical formula, NIST says, in effect, then a miracle happens. Why this would be a miracle was explained by Chandler, who I also think is here today. David Chandler, stand up, another hero. The one guy in the world, I believe, who made NIST change something between the first report and the second one. David Chandler said, free fall can only be achieved if there is zero resistance to the motion. In other words, the upper portion of Building 7 could have come down in free fall only if something had suddenly removed all the steel and concrete in the lower part, which would have otherwise provided some resistance. If everything had not been removed and the upper floors had come down in free fall anyway, even if only for a quarter of a second, that would have been a miracle, meaning a violation of basic laws of physics. That was what Sundar himself had explained the previous August, saying that a free-falling object would be one that has no structural components below it to offer resistance. But then in November, while still defending the fire theory of the collapse, NIST agreed that as an empirical fact, free fall happened. For a period of 2.25 seconds, NIST admitted the descent of World Trade Center 7 was characterized by gravitational acceleration free fall. Knowing that it had thereby affirmed a miracle, NIST no longer claimed that its analysis was consistent with the laws of physics. In its August draft, in which it said that the collapse occurred 40% slower than freefall, NIST had repeatedly said that its analysis was consistent with physical principles. Readers encountered this phrase time and time again, but in the final draft, every instance of this phrase had been removed. In the final report, NIST therefore almost explicitly admitted that its report on World Trade Center 7, by admitting freefall while continuing to deny that explosives were used, is not consistent with the laws of physics. NIST thereby implicitly admitted that explosives were used to bring down Building 7. And with that implicit admission, NIST implicitly admitted that the same about the Twin Towers, the collapses of which manifested many of the same telltale signs of controlled demolition, including, plus some additional ones, such as the horizontal ejection of steel beams outward some 500, 600 feet. And with this implicit admission that explosives were used, NIST undermined the Al-Qaeda theory of 9/11. Why? For one thing, the straight-down nature of the collapse of the Twin Towers and Building 7 means that the buildings were subjected to that type of controlled demolition known as implosion, which in the words of a controlled demolition website is by far the trickiest type of explosive project which only a handful of companies in the world possess enough experience to perform. Al-Qaeda terrorists would not have had the expertise. Second, the only reason to go to the trouble of bringing the building straight down is to avoid damaging nearby buildings. Had the World Trade Center buildings toppled over sideways, they would have caused massive destruction in lower Manhattan, killing many tens of thousands of people. Does anyone believe that if Al-Qaeda operatives had had the expertise to bring the building straight down, they would have had the courtesy? A third problem is that foreign terrorists could not have obtained access to the buildings for all the hours it would have taken to plant explosives. Only insiders, domestic terrorists, could have done this. NIST's admission that Building 7 came down in freefall for over 2 seconds should therefore have been front-page news. The same is true, moreover, of the various other things I've reported: NIST fabrications, NIST omission and distortion of testimonial evidence, NIST omission of physical evidence, such as the Swiss cheese steel, and the particles showing that iron and molybdenum had been melted, and the later discovery of nanothermite particles in the World Trade Center dust. Especially given the fact that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 had been declared a mystery from the outset, the world should have been waiting with bated breath for every new clue as to why this 47-story building had come down. Upon hearing Building 7 mentioned, nobody in the world with access to CNN should have replied, "Building what?" How do we explain the fact that 5 and even 9 years after 9/11, the mysterious collapse of this building was still a matter of widespread ignorance, the very fact that it had collapsed? To begin answering this question, let us turn to James Glantz's statement that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was a mystery that under normal circumstances would have captured the attention of the city and the world. As I stated before, the abnormality seems to have been such that the fact of this building's collapse, and specifically the videos of this collapse, were deliberately suppressed. What was this abnormality? A symposium in the February 2010 issue of American Behavioral Scientist, one of our leading social science journals, argues that social scientists need to develop a scientific approach to studying an increasingly important type of criminality, state crimes against democracy, abbreviated SCADs. Understood as concerted actions by government insiders intended to manipulate democratic processes and undermine popular sovereignty, having the potential to subvert political institutions and entire governments. SCADs are high crimes that attack democracy itself. Distinguishing between SCADs that have been officially proven, such as the Watergate break-ins and cover-up, the secret wars in Laos and Cambodia, the illegal arms sales and covert operations in Iran-Contra, and the effort to discredit Joseph Wilson by revealing his wife's status as an intelligence agent, and suspected SCADs, distinguishing those from suspected SCADs for which there is good evidence. The symposium authors include in the latter category the fabricated attacks on U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, the October surprises in the presidential elections of 1968 and 1980, and the assassinations of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, the election breakdowns in 2000 and 2004, the numerous defense failures of September 11, 2001, and the misrepresentation of intelligence to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq. Moreover, besides regarding the 9/11 attacks as one of the suspected SCADs for which there is good evidence, this symposium treats it, in fact, as its primary example. The abstract for the introductory essay begins by asserting the ellipses of due diligence riddling the official account of the 9/11 incidents continue being ignored by scholars of policy and public administration. The symposium's final essay, criticizing the majority of the academic world for its blithe dismissal of more than one law of thermodynamics that is violated by the official theory of the World Trade Center collapses, also criticizes the Academy for its failure to protest when Professor Stephen Jones found himself forced out of a tenured position for merely reminding the world that physical laws about which there is no dissent whatsoever contradict the official theory of the World Trade Center towers collapse. Now, if 9/11 was a SCAD, then we would understand the full extent to which the destruction of the World Trade Center occurred under abnormal circumstances. And we would thereby be in position to understand why the collapse of Building 7, which under normal circumstances would probably have captured the attention of the city and the world, did not do so. It was not allowed to become well known for reasons mentioned earlier. Unlike the Twin Towers, it was not hit by a plane. Because of this, there was no jet fuel to spread big fires to many floors, and its collapse, unlike that of each of the Twin Towers, looked exactly like a classic implosion in which the collapse begins from the bottom and the building folds in upon itself, ending up in a tidy pile in its own footprint. The fact that Building 7 was brought down by explosives was therefore much more obvious. This greater obviousness is illustrated not only by Danny Yowinkle's responses, but also by many engineers and scientists who joined the 9/11 Truth movement only after seeing a video of this building's collapse. For example, Daniel Hoffnung, an engineer in Paris, wrote, "In the years after the 9/11 events, I thought that all I read in professional reviews and French newspapers was true. The first time I understand that it was impossible was when I saw a film about the collapse of World Trade Center 7. Civil engineer Chester Gearhart of Kansas City wrote, "I have watched the construction of many large buildings and have also personally witnessed 5 controlled demolitions in Kansas City. When I saw the towers fall on 9/11, I knew something was wrong, and my first instinct was that it was impossible. When I saw Building 7 fall, I knew it was controlled demolition." This video was even decisive for University of Copenhagen chemist Niels Harrit, who later became the first author of the nanothermite paper. When asked how he became involved with these issues, he replied, "It all started when I saw the collapse of Building 7, the 3rd skyscraper. It collapsed 7 hours after the Twin Towers. And there were only 2 airplanes. When you see a 47-story building, 186 meters tall, collapse in 6.5 seconds, and you are a scientist, you think, what? I had to watch it again and again. I hit the button 10 times, and my jaw dropped lower and lower. Firstly, I had never heard of that building before, and there was no visible reason why it should collapse in such a way, straight down in 6.5 seconds. I've had no rest since that day. Given these reactions, it is obvious why, if 9/11 was a state crime against democracy, the fact of Building 7's collapse, and especially the video of this collapse, had to be suppressed as much as possible. Having made this point, I need to respond to an obvious objection. If those who were responsible for bringing down Building 7 were going to need to suppress the video of its collapse, why did they wait until late in the day when the air was clean and cameras would be focused on this building to bring it down? So that we have these perfectly clear videos from many angles of the building coming down in free fall. Why didn't they not bring it down in the morning, shortly after one of the towers had collapsed, when the air was filled with dust, so photos and videos were impossible? For example, they could have brought it down at 10:45, which would have been about 17 minutes after the collapse of the North Tower, and the air was still so dense with dust and smoke that all the cameramen had to run away, and according to NIST, did not start returning until 11 o'clock. Why didn't they bring it down then? Well, as I've reported in an appendix to the mysterious collapse of World Trade Center 7, it looks like that's what they meant to do. I won't give the evidence here, but it appears that Building 7 was, as one researcher put it, a dud. The explosion started going off, and at some point they quit. And the building, as he put it, defiantly stood there. As a result, agents had to be sent into the building. This is speculative, that's why it's in the appendix, so that the cover story could be that fires had brought the building down. This hypothesis would explain why, although the fires in Building 7 allegedly were started at 10:28 when the North Tower collapsed and sent flaming debris all that distance, fires did not start to become visible until afternoon. NIST itself admits that. In any case, had the demolition system worked as intended, this building's collapse would still have been a big mystery, but there would have been no videos showing that it had come straight down and for over 2 seconds in absolute free fall, and you would have never heard of David Chandler. I emphasize this likelihood. The destruction of World Trade Center 7 was a botched operation because, if true, it provides the clearest possible illustration of the theme of this lecture, namely that SCADs can be hidden in plain sight. There are literally dozens of contradictions in the official account of 9/11 that show it to have been an inside job. But the clearest proof of this is provided by the video of this enormous building coming straight down in absolute free fall. And yet, even though this proof has existed in plain sight for all these years, the fact that 9/11 was an inside job and hence a state crime against democracy has remained a hidden fact, at least in the sense that it is not part of the public conversation. How has this hiding been achieved? Peter Dale Scott, discussing the erosion of the Constitution and laws of the open or public state by the American deep state, suggests that this erosion has been achieved in part through a series of important deep events in post-World War II American history, events, aspects of which will be ignored or suppressed in the mainstream media. Indeed, Scott adds, the mainstream U.S. media having become so implicated in past protective lies that they, as well as the government, have now a demonstrated interest in preventing the truth of any of these events from coming out. This means that the current threat to constitutional rights does not derive from the deep state alone. The problem is a global dominance mindset that prevails not only inside the Washington Beltway, but also in the mainstream media. One which has come to accept recent inroads to constitutional liberties and stigmatizes, or at least responds with silence to, those who are alarmed by them. Acceptance of this mindset's notion of decorum has increasingly become a condition for participating in mainstream public life. Referring thereby to events such as the JFK assassination, the Tonkin Gulf hoax, and 9/11, Scott, by deep events, means the same types of events called SCADs by the authors of the Symposium in American Behavioral Scientists. Indeed, one of these authors explicitly cites Scott's writings, treating his deep state events as examples of SCADs, and quoting his statements about the complicity of the mainstream media in covering up the truth of these events. These authors also make the same point themselves, remarking that the U.S. government's account of 9/11 is parroted by the mainstream media, and commenting upon the profound disavowal of still burning, molten questions originating at 9/11 Ground Zero, gone begging by the American media. Besides parroting the government's account of 9/11 and stigmatizing those who provide alternative accounts with the discrediting label conspiracy theorist, how has America's mainstream media kept the truth about World Trade Center 7 hidden from the majority of the American people and the world? Through various means. First, by never replaying the statements by Dan Rather and other reporters about how the collapse of World Trade Center 7 looked exactly like a controlled demolition. Second, by seldom, if ever, replaying the video of this building's collapse. Third, by never mentioning credible critiques of the official account. For example, my book, The Mysterious Collapse of World Trade Center 7, subtitled, Why the Final Official Report About 9/11 is Unscientific and False, which has been endorsed by prestigious scientists and engineers, has never been reviewed in the mainstream media or even mentioned, even though my previous 9/11 book, The New Pearl Harbor Revisited, was a Publisher's Weekly Pick of the Week in November 2008. Fourth, by never mentioning, except for one story in the Washington Times that evidently slipped through, the existence of an organization called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, which now has 1,200 licensed members calling for a new investigation, i.e. a real investigation of World Trade Center 7, as well as the Twin Towers. Fifth, by never reporting scientific evidence contradicting the official account of this building, such as the reported discovery of nanothermite in the dust. Sixth, by overlooking the fact that NIST's report on World Trade Center 7 omitted an enormous amount of evidence showing that explosives must have been used. For example, after calling that piece of Swiss cheese steel recovered from Building 7 the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, the New York Times did not issue a peep when NIST's 2008 report did not mention this mysterious piece of steel and even denied that any steel from this building had been recovered. Not a peep. Seventh, by reporting NIST's August press conference announcing the draft for public comment, in which Sunder announced with great bravado that the mystery of World Trade Center 7 had been solved, and that science is really behind what we have said, but then not reporting on the final report and the fact that NIST in it almost explicitly admitted that science does not stand behind its theory of this building's collapse. Through these and related means, the American deep state and its controlled media have hidden the truth about the collapse of Building 7, even though it has existed in plain sight for all these years. They have even to a great extent hidden the fact of the collapse itself, so that in 2006, over 40% of American people still did not know that it had occurred, and in 2009, a judge in New York City, upon hearing its name, could reply, "Building what?" I offer this lecture as a case study in the power of the deep state and its controlled media to hide things that exist in plain sight. Because if they can hide the straight-down, free-fall collapse of a 47-story building captured on video in broad daylight, they can hide anything. I say this, however, not to instill despair, but to point to the seriousness of the problem we face, and also to pave the way for making a proposal in the spirit of Peter Dale Scott's important essay, 9/11, Deep State Violence, and the Hope of Internet Politics. Recognizing the high correlation between those who are aware of the collapse of Building 7 and those who believe a new, that is, a real investigation is needed, I propose that we initiate, and this was suggested by the New York City CAN lawyers, a Building What campaign. And I, in particular, propose that we initiate it with hopefully, all the 9/11 groups in America and around the world participating, that we initiate it this September with the goal of making as many people on the planet as possible aware of the collapse of World Trade Center 7 by the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And let us ensure that this building is never again known as Building What. Thank you very much.